Welcome back. We're joined now by Jake Macleod. He is founder of Graybeards Consulting and also the former CTO of Bechtel. Jake, thanks so much for coming to Austin today.
Glad to be here. Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, you are in a unique position to comment on the outlook for wireless infrastructure in 2016 because you've been asked to chair PCIA's Technology and Innovation Council. And it sounds like a lot of the work of this group is focused on jump-starting deployments for DAS and small cells. Is that accurate?
That's correct. PCIA is an infrastructure association, and so consequently, we're focusing our working groups on the financial equation for small cell deployment because we feel like, or small cell and DAS deployment, because we feel like that's really a hindrance at this point. We just completed 3 working group papers, or white papers, one on fiber and backhaul, and one on street furniture, and the last one on small cell and DAS, sort of a definition or overview tutorial. We just initiated 5 more working groups in the industry, and we kicked them off about 2 months ago. And we're talking to the CIOs of the various industry verticals to help them understand what small cell and DAS is. The second group is a group that is working on just a fundamental definition of small cell and DAS for the metropolitan areas and the CIOs and the city managers so they understand what this is and don't overzone it.
Yeah.
Because that's a real problem. Another one, another working group, we're working with the University of Maryland to establish some curricula for the workforce of the future for infrastructure, and that's critical. The fourth working group is looking at pole attachments and the requirements for that with regard to the geometry, et cetera, of the available devices and the real estate, the vertical real estate that is required by these devices. And lastly, we're coordinating with the architectural committees at PCIA with another working group. So there are 5 working groups that are focused entirely on small cell and DAS deployments.
Great. Well, a couple of the ones you mentioned, I'd like to go a little deeper. You mentioned talking to CIOs of various verticals. Can you elaborate which verticals?
Oh, the hospitality, the medical verticals, the city and county and municipalities. They're still typically in the past and currently the municipalities they're looking at the small cell deployments as if it was a macro cell. And they are subsequently requiring zoning and permitting and which has caused the fundamental issue for the delay in small cell deployment is the zoning, permitting, and the site development, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to educate the CIOs of the municipalities that this is not a macro cell deployment. And the revenues garnered off of these small cells in no way compare to the revenues garnered off of a macro cell.
Right, and then what about the work with the University of Maryland around the wireless workforce? What are some of the key skill sets that you're trying to develop there?
Oh goodness, with the advent of the Internet of Things, it is currently a tsunami that they're working diligently to accommodate, but it's just going to blow us away in the future. And so we need to have a workforce, a trained and qualified workforce in the future. Right now, you have to send if you've got fiber to the top of the tower, typically the current technicians that climb towers aren't qualified to do fiber splicing. Or if they take a piece of test equipment up, they're typically not trained on the outputs of the test equipment to be able to make a judgment on what the problem is. So our workforce of the future from an infrastructure perspective is going to have to increase its game with regard to knowledge of test equipment, being able to understand what's on top of the tower, how to splice fiber, what does the OTDR say and what does it mean, and therefore what prescriptive action do I take to remedy the problem? That sort of thing.
So the test and measurement companies are probably highly involved in that group?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, and then you talked a little bit earlier about the municipalities and helping them understand the economics of a small cell deployment. Are there any municipalities that are starting to get it and take proactive actions that are going to help?
Yes, as a matter of fact, there are a couple. There's LA and then New York City. I was talking with Alfonso Jenkins
yeah.
up in New York City, and he presented a paper or a presentation recently at a conference that just was really spot on. They're, with regard to zoning and permitting, they're doing bulk zoning and permitting to reduce the cost and reduce the schedule for deployment. They're also working with a company to replace all of the, 10,000 of the phone booths with kiosks. The kiosks will garner advertising by the electronic advertising boards that are going to be on these small kiosks. In addition, they'll provide public Wi-Fi and also space and backhaul for any of the carriers that they want to put on there, whether they're LTE or any of the public carriers.
Now, which company is manufacturing that equipment?
That
Kiosks.
the manufacturing, I know Qualcomm and Google are both involved in that, but
the actual street furniture, the kiosks.
yeah, I'm not sure who is manufacturing the street furniture.
Yeah, that's a big job. I know Mr. Jenkins has an RFI out also for the street lights. He wants to get new street lights that can accommodate more than one cabinet for small cells in each street light. So that'll be interesting to watch.
It will be, and New York is taking a very aggressive action in being able to supply that. There's a lot of public safety issues that can be remedied with this as well. So I think it could be a model that we could adopt across the nation.
Well, let's hope so. So getting back to what we've seen up to now with small cells, we know AT&T said maybe a couple years ago 40,000 small cells, and estimates are that the carrier ended up doing about 7,000 before it turned its attention elsewhere. Now it looks like Verizon is really stepping it up. We hear Verizon's name a lot in the markets that you and I have just been talking about. Do you see Verizon sort of moving to the fore in 2016 as far as outdoor small cells?
Any viable business, and the AT&Ts and the Verizons and the T-Mobiles and the Sprints of the world have to look at, if I'm putting in this much money, what's the return on that deployment? Well, what happened in small cell is they said, okay, we did all our advanced planning, it looks good, we're going to get an acceptable return, but there was a miscalculation on the cost, the actual cost of deployment, and that includes zoning and permitting and
backhaul and power as well,
backhaul and power. And so it was a significant miscalculation that caused the spigot to be turned off until they can fix that equation. Then the primary issue is the cost of deployment.
I see.
So all of the deployments that you're seeing now, in my mind, all or most, if not all, are very surgical deployments, meaning I've got to have coverage here, I've been waiting here, I don't have any choice but to supply coverage to this area. I can do it with a small cell, that's what I'm going to do. So until we can get the economic equation in balance to provide the appropriate return on investment for these carriers, then we're going to have a hard time deploying small cells.
Right. So you would include Verizon in that characterization,
Yes.
that it's still surgical?
Yes.
Okay, now Sprint has said they're going to do tens of thousands. They haven't said when or where or how, but that doesn't sound surgical. It sounds strategic.
It sounds broadcast. I am not close to Sprint, but I would challenge that number very carefully before I committed to hiring people to go to build it. I would challenge it and get some guarantees for demobilization in the event the spigot is turned off.
Right, right. So do you see any developments on the technical front that are bringing down some of the costs?
Yeah, well, some of the technical issues are the longevity of the of the technology. Example, if you put in a small cell today, is it going to be able to migrate to 5G? And all the carriers now are looking at 5G because it's right around the corner. And so if you invest X millions of dollars in this 4G deployment or even 3G deployment, is there a roadmap to get you to 5G? Otherwise, why put it in? So it's a real struggle now from an economic perspective. There are some technologies that are coming out specifically targeted at the IoT arena, the data transfer for sensors with regard to the smart grid or the power systems, the distribution systems for oil field, and it's called random phase multiple access, couched in the 2.4 gig band. And it has a receiver sensitivity of neg 148, which is really, really impressive, which gives you quite a big footprint. I have a number of questions. The jury's still out on that. I have a number of questions with regard to the viability, but the longevity of the technology, they're estimating it to be 15 to 20 years. So if you're going to buy sensors for your power meter, for example, the power meters that were put out initially were based on GSM, and they have real short datagrams that pop out and tell, read the meters. Well, GSM is sunsetting now. Now what do you do with the millions of embedded devices that are out there? So that's one of the things the power companies and the vertical industries have to look at, is the longevity of the device that I'm going to purchase today. Has it got a runway of 4 years, 5 years, or 20 years? And that gives you a different economic variable to play with in your return on investment equation.
Right. Well, that is really interesting. Now, with the Internet of Things and 5G, I think 2016 will be a year when perhaps we'll see some more progress towards standardization. But it sounds like the companies that are in a position to think about deploying this might want to wait until there's a little more clarity there if one of their key questions is about migrating to 5G or using this technology for IoT.
Yes, you couch that very carefully. Yes, it is. You are right. Each of the carriers, from a technical perspective, have to look at the runway of the infrastructure that they're putting in today. If their runway is less than 5 years, they're not going to put it in, or they'll only put it in a surgical fashion where they're forced to put it in.
So it's interesting because we don't usually think about the standardization work as having an immediate economic impact on the ecosystem, but it could if it helps give companies some confidence to invest if they feel that this is a roadmap that they can look at or no.
Standards, the IoT is moving so quickly. The standards are way behind. The typical standard process takes 10 years, 8 to 10 years to standardize something. So we've got to somehow short circuit the standards process, and we've tried that ever since IS 136, which is 1.5 to 2G. We tried to short circuit the standards, and we wound up with 5 different standards in the United States, which put us way behind the rest of the world at that point. We've since caught up, but standards is a real tricky issue. I had one major carrier, when I was working for an OEM, I had to go back to this major carrier and tell one of the senior vice presidents, I said, you're asking for us to build something that's non-standard. And he looked at me straight in the eye, and I'll never forget this as a young engineer. He looked me straight in the eye, he said, Jake, we are a standard. Oh. And he is. I mean, they had the wherewithal to turn the industry around, and they did.
So you're saying that there have been 5 different standards in the U.S. to date?
That was for 2G.
Okay, all right. For IoT, I'm interested in your comment that the industry needs to short circuit the standards process. What does that mean specifically?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm clueless there. How to short circuit a process that's been proven, and companies build to standards, and the whole industry comes around those standards. That's the proper way to do it, but it takes time.
I think 3GPP standardized or said they wanted to standardize around narrowband spectrum IoT. Is that correct?
I'm not familiar with that. No.
Okay, well, we're supposed to be talking about small cells and dust anyway, so let's get back to that.
Chasing rabbits.
That's right. Power and backhaul are the two that we haven't really gotten into that much. I know that the zoning issues are very significant, but companies also talk a lot about trying to understand where the backhaul is before they commit, how they're going to power it. And I think maybe the cable operators are stepping up to try to help with that, or would like to. Do you see that in 2016?
Well, the carriers are using any avenue possible. Lease lines, fiber pops, you name it. Anything that is available, microwave, high capacity microwave, point to point, very high frequencies. They're using anything they can get that is highly reliable and high capacity. Now that can be microwave, it can be fiber, it can be cable, whatever. So it's just not the cable companies. It's if you need a coverage in this area, you have to analyze how do I get it back to the core.
Right.
So anything.
Okay. Well, wireless backhaul is interesting, and we don't hear a lot about that because I think that's perhaps talked about, or maybe so far used less than wired backhaul. But do you see more opportunity for that?
Oh, sure. If you need a quick deployment on a temporary basis, do point-to-point microwave, or on a permanent basis. There are some companies now that are out there that have some very significant claims with regard to capacity and reliability and distance.
Right.
So those are worth looking at as a permanent solution.
Do you think the carriers are talking to those companies?
Oh, no doubt about it.
No doubt. Okay. Okay. All right. Great. Now, another issue that we hear a lot about with the small cells outdoor is the concealment, and we hear about all kinds of companies popping up to offer solutions in this area. I'm guessing that you see the same?
Yes, concealment, it's a very expensive thing when you start putting these things in church steeples or making them look like a pine tree or a deciduous tree. It becomes very expensive if that's what you're talking about. But the geometry of the OEM equipment that is going to be deployed has to be reduced. I mean, the physical size of the devices, the power consumption, et cetera, needs to be reduced in order to place them on poles or on street furniture. So right now it's a little bit too big from a geometric perspective, but we're getting there. The OEMs are, like Ericsson's working on the light pole, the small pole. Google and Qualcomm are working on the kiosks. So there are a number of companies that are going all in to make certain that the geometry of the small cell deployment is appropriate for zoning and planning.
So it sounds like you're saying that as the size of the radio equipment comes down, the physical structure to support it will follow. That's not the hard part. It sounds like that's what you're saying. Okay. Okay.
But in the past, when you're talking about stealthing, it just starts with the dollar sign.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's why you see it in all those high-end suburbs, and that's about where you see it, right?
Yeah.
So is there anything else on outdoor small cells before we move to talk about indoor deployments?
No, the outdoor small cells have, in the tier 1 areas like the stadiums and such, they're pretty much done, but they've got a finite technology. They've been installed with a finite technology. So the market there is going to be upgrades.
You're talking about indoor DAS?
Well, yeah.
Indoor and outdoor?
Yeah.
Because, yeah, we do hear that a lot of the stadiums and big hotels, et cetera, that would support a DAS, they have one by now, and some of them, of course, are still upgrading to LTE or are adding on. But the vendors, as you well know, are looking to the enterprise to fund the next round of deployments. You mentioned your work with the healthcare vertical and the hospitality vertical, so maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what the thinking is when you talk to these enterprises.
Sure. One of the major, we just finished a study for one of the major hospitality industry players, and their franchisees and their corporately owned facilities are all over the map.
Okay.
They're totally non-standard with regard to deployments, and they're looking for some way to uniformitize their deployments and to also to attract the major carriers in each area. The problem with that is not a technical one, it's more of a political one.
Yeah.
In attracting the carriers that don't want to play together is very difficult. And so the carrier or the hospitality industry, I know for at least two of them, are more than willing to purchase the capital equipment and have the carriers just place their gear on their internal DAS systems. And that's not even attractive to the carriers, because the carriers don't want to spend, well, number one, whenever you place a cell site, you've got to integrate it into your overall RF plan, which means frequency coordination and interference calculations, et cetera. So if the carrier can illuminate that hospitality or that area with an adequate signal indoors and outdoors by simple down tilt or azimuth change, that's the cheapest route.
Right.
That's the route that they'll choose first. If they can't provide that, then they have to do an economic analysis and a technical analysis to determine, if I place X number of dollars of capital equipment in this hotel, am I going to get the return on investment? And how is it going to affect the rest of my system? And I'm going to have to maintain it. I'm going to have to upgrade it, when the new technologies come about. So it's a real dilemma. There are a lot of moving parts to that decision.
And it's much more complex if they have to share. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, yeah. And of course, everyone on the non-carrier side would like to be able to just go to Radio Shack and buy something and solve the problem.
Right.
Doesn't happen that way. And we developed a pretty intricate decision tree for this particular report that started from the beginning. Do you have a coverage problem? How do you know you got a coverage problem? How did you measure it? Because the carriers aren't going to listen to you unless you've identified very carefully where the coverage problem is within your facility. Then they have something to work with. If you don't bring that to them first, it's like everybody else wants better coverage.
Yep. Well, we do hear so much, again, from the vendors about the centralized head-ends, the centralized RAN. So if the carriers could place their antennas where they want them and just share some of that baseband processing space, why is that not palatable to the carriers?
Well, it's palatable. It makes sense.
Right.
It makes total sense for the carriers to share a single and RF distribution facility.
Okay.
But the carriers don't want, they have different standards. They have different methods of deployment, different methods for performance and measuring performance. And one carrier doesn't want to adopt the other carrier's performance characteristics or coverage characteristics. This is the way we've done it for the past 40 years. We're not going to change. This is the way we've done it for the past. It's not a technical issue. It's totally a political issue, and if the bean counters could get involved, they would say that it makes 100% financial sense to do that because you save tremendous amount of capital and operational expense. But I grew up in the Bell system, and this was before divestiture, and the infrastructure was our family jewels. You didn't mess with it. We own it, we run it, we operate it, and we know that it's reliable. And that's still the carrier's perspective today.
Right.
So I respect that. It's
Right.
important. They want to provide a quality service to their customers.
Right, which we all rely on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, anything else on indoor deployments that you want to make sure we discuss?
No, I think that covered it. We can chase all kinds of rabbits for the rest of the day, but thank you very much for having me here.
Well, thank you, Jake Macleod, Graybeards Consulting. It's always great to get your perspective.
Thank you.